Good afternoon. I'm delighted to see those of you here today and welcome those that are joining online. I'm Mike Solomon, Dean of the Graduate School, and I have the honor to welcome you to this ceremony today. Good afternoon. This is this year's Henry Russell Awards program and lecture. This is a very special event on the university's calendar. It's a day that we honor a colleague with the highest distinction the institution can bestow, the Russell Lectureship. The 2025 Henry Russell Lecturer is Ruth Bahar, whom Provost Lori McCauley will introduce to you shortly. I will now share with you the history about the namesake for the Russell Award. Henry Russell earned 3 degrees from the University of Michigan, a Bachelor of Arts degree in 1873, a law degree in 1875, and then a Master of Arts degree in 1876. Russell was born in Detroit and remained in Michigan after graduation, where he was a successful lawyer and prosperous businessman who was involved with the Michigan Central Railroad, the Michigan State Telephone Company, Union Trust Company, People's State Bank, and the Detroit Steel Products Company. In February 1920, while in New York City, Russell took ill and died at the age of 67 from pneumonia, just as he was preparing to travel to Europe to claim the body of his son, Lieutenant William M. Russell, who was killed in aerial combat during World War I. In his will, Henry Russell left the University of Michigan a $10,000 bequest to create an endowment fund. His one stipulation was that the income from the endowment should be used for additional compensation to members of the instructing staff. In May of 1925, the Regents established the Henry Russell Lecture as a way to recognize a senior member of the faculty with an honorarium of $250 funded by Russell's endowment. In addition, $250 was dedicated for an additional award to honor a faculty member below the rank of professor for conspicuous service to the university. Although the funds from Russell's bequest have long ago run out, the university continues to honor its most accomplished faculty with the award in his name. I am honored to be involved in today's ceremony to recognize these outstanding faculty members. And I would now like to invite my colleague, Provost McCauley, to present the Henry Russell Award to 4 faculty members. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dean Solomon, and my heartfelt welcome to colleagues and friends on this celebratory event. This is really one of my favorite events on our campus. And I'm going to jump right in and invite our first awardee. Will Professor Robin Brewer please join me on the stage? Robin Brewer, working at the intersection of technology, accessibility, and disability justice, has been making the world a better, more inclusive place by investigating how to design AI-powered technologies that best serve the needs of older adults, disabled individuals, and caregivers. Brewer joined U of M School of Information as a presidential postdoctoral fellow in 2017 and became an assistant professor in 2019. She co-founded the Accessibility, HCI, and Aging, or AHA Lab in 2021, and she has received numerous prestigious grants and awards. In 2023, Popular Science cited Brewer as one of the Brilliant 10, a list of 10 early career scientists who are on the cusp of changing the world, and we couldn't agree more. Professor Brewer, in recognition of your human-first approach to technology design for older and disabled people and your efforts to increase both the dignity and visibility of these underserved populations, the University of Michigan presents you with the Henry Russell Award. Okay, now will Professor Roya and Safi please join me at the lectern? Roya and Safi, a champion of free speech in our digital age, builds systems that aid in the global fight against government censorship, geodiscrimination, and surveillance. Her lab, Censored Planet, founded in 2018, has already made a significant impact in the world, providing crucial insights about online monitoring and information suppression in Kazakhstan, Saudi Arabia, Russia, and China. Originally from Iran, Safi joined Michigan's engineering faculty in 2017. She's received an Alfred P. Sloan Research Fellowship, a Google Faculty Research Award, an NSF Faculty Early Career Development Award, among other accolades, and her lab's work has been cited in the New York Times, Newsweek, Business Insider, Wired, and Ars Technica. Professor Safi, in recognition of your efforts to protect internet users around the world from disruptions, surveillance, and digital inequity, and thus generally promote the freedom of expression online for all, the University of Michigan presents you with the Henry Russel Award.
Thank you.
Okay, next will Professor Mark Hannaford please join me up on the stage. Mark Hannaford has spent his career exploring new ideas about musical structure, both as a scholar and as an improvising pianist. Driven by curiosity, Hannaford orients his scholarly and creative practice around jazz and improvisation, identity and performance. Beginning his career in his native Australia, Hannaford joined U of M's faculty in 2020. One of his recent academic papers merited winning the 2023 Emerging Scholar Award from the Society for Music Theory. His in-progress book project entitled Feeling to Thought to Feeling, Music Theory and African American Creative Practice investigates the work of African American music theorists from the second half of the 20th century, their ideas about musical structure, and the socio-political resonances of their work. Professor Hannaford, in recognition of your efforts to explore and unpack the building blocks of music and to constantly expand our sense of what music can be, the University of Michigan presents you with the Henry Russel Award. Okay, will Professor Wenjing Wang please join me up on the stage? Wenjing Wang discovered her passion for protein engineering in graduate school while exploring the sources of retinal pigment color. As a postdoc, she designed a light-sensing, protein-based tool to label neuronal circuits, and currently her lab is forging entirely new paths in this field, working to help find new and improved ways to conduct biological studies. Originally from a small town in southeast China, Wang joined U of M's faculty in 2018. She received the NIH Director's New Innovator Award in 2022, among other accolades. Her name is on 3 patents thus far, and the Wenjing Wang Lab at the University of Michigan is working to develop molecular tools for monitoring and manipulating various biological processes with a spatiotemporal control to advance neuroscience research and potential therapeutics. Professor Wang, in recognition of your pioneering work in protein engineering, which promises to facilitate critical studies in both neuroscience and cell biology, the University of Michigan presents you with one of its highest honors, the Henry Russel Award. Okay, and now we will turn to the presentation of the Henry Russel Lectureship Award. Considered the university's highest honor for a senior member of its active faculty, the Henry Russel Lectureship is awarded annually to recognize a faculty member of exceptional achievements in research, scholarship, or creative endeavors, and an outstanding record of distinguished teaching, mentoring, and service to the university and wider communities. As part of this awards presentation, the recipient is asked to deliver a lecture to the university community. It's an honor today to present this year's Henry Russel Lectureship to Professor Ruth Behar. I invite her to come forward as I read the citation that she's receiving. Ruth Behar has spent her career listening to, reporting, and writing stories that might otherwise be overlooked, maximizing their impact by making them broadly accessible. Through Behar's anthropologic lens and through her various creative writing projects, she has shone a spotlight on, to name two examples, Sephardic Jews and women in Spanish-speaking countries, including Cuba, Mexico, and Spain, sometimes using her own family's heritage and life experiences as a jumping-off point. She's also grappled with the subjective ethics of being an anthropologist, coining the term vulnerable observer, which she has since entered ethical conversations in fields as diverse as women's studies, medicine, education, social work, and creative writing. Professor Behar earned a BA in literature from Wesleyan University and an MA and PhD in cultural anthropology from Princeton before joining the anthropology faculty here at the University of Michigan in 1986. Behar was the first Latina to receive a MacArthur Foundation Fellows Award, otherwise known as a Genius Grant, in 1988. During the course of her career, she's received numerous awards, including a Guggenheim, a Fulbright, a Michigan Humanities Award, and a Distinguished Alumna Award from Wesleyan University. In addition to her many academic publications, she made a documentary film in 2002, Adio Querida, Goodbye Dear Love, a Cuban Sephardic Journey. She has written award-winning novels for young people, Letters from Cuba, Across So Many Seas, and Lucky Broken Girl, and two picture books, Tia Fortuna's New Home and Pepita Meets Bebita, co-authored with her son, Gabrielle. Professor Behar, in recognition of your efforts to build a bridge between cultures through storytelling, both as an academic and an artist, and your groundbreaking work to investigate subjectivity in anthropology, the University of Michigan presents you with the highest honor for senior active faculty members, the Henry Russel Lectureship. I know we're in for a treat. Please join me in welcoming our 2025 Henry Russell Lecturer, Ruth Behar, delivering her lecture, The Gift of Shared Stories.
Well, thank you so much. Thank you, Dean Solomon, and thank you, Provost Macaulay, for those lovely introductions. I want to add my congratulations to the Henry Russell Award recipients, to Professor Brewer, Professor Ansafi, Professor Hannaford, and Professor Wang, and also say how incredibly grateful I am for having been named the Russell Lecturer this year in the centennial anniversary. I'm humbled and honored to be part of this long-standing genealogy at the University of Michigan, and so glad to be with all of you today to share some stories. All right, well, you see something interesting over here, right? I've lived, does that sound okay? Yeah, okay. I've lived with a suitcase by my bed as long as I can remember. I am a daughter and a granddaughter of immigrants and was a child immigrant. I've spent most of my adult life traveling to Spain, Mexico, and Cuba. I view myself as an anthropologist and a writer who listens to stories and tells stories, and through this process, I make sense of how people give meaning to the mystery of being human. Before I went into anthropology, I was drawn to philosophy. I bought a copy of Simone de Beauvoir's The Second Sex at the Strand's outdoor rack for 25 cents and devoured it before going to college, and that's what gave me the idea to be a philosopher. But I was told by a professor I much admired that I didn't have the analytical capacity to be a philosopher. And yeah. I also thought of being a poet because I loved Garcia Lorca's poems and memorized them in Spanish, but was told by another professor that I wouldn't make a good poet. So I put those dreams aside. Then I stumbled into an anthropology class and thought maybe I could be a philosopher and a poet by going places and talking to people. One of the first books I read in graduate school in anthropology was The Gift, Forms and Functions of Exchange in Archaic Societies by Marcel Mauss. The original French essay was published in 1925, and Mauss proposed something radical. Drawing on diverse examples from ancient Rome to Melanesia, he showed how gift-giving had created circles of exchange that flowed back and forth. Gifts received called for more gifts in return. In this way, lasting moral bonds were built over time from people to people. As I look back at the encounters I've had as an anthropologist, I want to reread Mauss's notion of the gift in another way. What I believe is given to us in the course of our fieldwork are stories, and when we receive them with grace, something unique happens that allows us to connect across borders and differences and gain not just an intellectual understanding, but an emotional understanding that transforms us. Over the years, strangers have brought me into their lives by sharing their stories and giving me space to share my stories in a circle of reciprocity that has let me experience the aura of the gift. This aura is what I want to evoke today in the stories I will share with you. All right. So it was the summer of 1978 when my professor, James Fernandez, dropped me and my husband, David, off in the pueblo of Santa Maria del Monte in the province of León. He had received a grant to bring students to northern Spain. Okay, now go do field work, he said, as he waved goodbye and drove off. I had no idea how to do field work. But the people of Santa Maria would teach me. They'd mold me into their anthropologist. In that village, where I had no roots. It was as close as I'd ever get to feeling that I had a pueblo. I found myself in the company of aging farmers who had an intimate relationship to the earth. They woke up early and had a hearty garlic and paprika broth with bread on top, served in small bowls made of the red clay of the region. I'll leave it right here. People raised rabbits, chickens, pigs, sheep, and cows in stables that were within their houses. I had to learn to overcome my shame and go to the bathroom in the stable with Mariposa and Linda, the cows. I was taken in like a long-lost granddaughter and shown how it hurt your kidneys to harvest potatoes. The summer months were occupied with gathering hay, harvesting wheat and rye, caring for vegetable gardens, and picking pears, cherries, and apples, ending with the grape harvest. I was struck by how the women were outside in the burning sun, just as the men were, doing hard physical labor. And they didn't shy away from the bloody side of agricultural life, deftly slaughtering a rabbit or a chicken for dinner. Fortunately, I didn't have to do it myself. But I had to put aside my Jewish customs, and so as not to offend my hosts, I consumed immeasurable amounts of pork and sausage. My desire to belong, to be part of the village, part of Spain, was so strong that I wondered sometimes what my Sephardic Jewish ancestors would have felt who left Spain rather than convert to Catholicism after the Edict of Expulsion of 1492. The villagers I met had lost their children and grandchildren to the rural exodus that had taken place in the years of the Franco dictatorship when they left the countryside to begin new lives in Madrid and other cities. I appeared wanting to bear witness to their efforts to remain on the land just when urbanization made it seem foolish and backward to grow your own food in little villages. Men and women alike said they were embarrassed to be working like brutes. They were so rooted in their land that they had never seen the ocean, even though the coast was only 2 hours away by car. All the same, I admired them. I didn't know how to grow my own food, and their rootedness was something I longed for. My first book, The Presence of the Past in a Spanish Village, appeared in 1986, the same year that I gave birth to my son, Gabriel, and arrived at the University of Michigan. A year later, I was asked to participate in a panel about the anthropology of death, and I decided to go back to the village to talk to people about this topic. As I was about to travel to Spain with David and one-year-old Gabriel, I learned that my maternal grandfather, Maximo Glinsky, whom we called Zede, was dying of cancer in Miami Beach. I was ready to cancel my plans and spend the summer helping to care for him, but my mother said, "No, Ruti, no estés esperando que muera. Don't be waiting for him to die," suggesting if I stayed, I'd be waiting for him to die. And so I chose to go to Spain, but I was haunted the entire time by the thought that Zede was dying in Miami Beach while I was studying death customs in Santa Maria. A few days before I planned to return, Maximo Glinsky, our Zede, died, and I could not get to the funeral in time. How would I ever forgive myself for putting my anthropology before my Zede? I felt an anger which the anthropologist Renato Rosaldo described in his book, The Day of Shelley's Death, as the rage that can come with devastating loss. That summer, together with David and Gabriel, I lived in the home of Polonia, a widow who had grown up in the village and moved to Madrid when she married. Her daughter, Rufi, and her husband and 2 sons were spending the summer with her in Santa Maria. Polonia vividly remembered her mother receiving Last Communion from the priest and that she'd washed her mother's body after she died in the middle of the night. Rufi was at once fascinated and disgusted at the idea of touching a dead body. They both noted that a shift had taken place. In the past, people died at home and received last rites from the local priest, while in the present day, death happened in the hospital. Loved ones received better medical care, but the family couldn't always be there, and many died a lonely death in an institutional setting. Polonia and Rufi feared such a lonely death for themselves. I told them about Zayde being on his deathbed in Miami Beach, and they hoped he'd live long enough for me to see him again. Then, when he died too soon and I couldn't get a flight back, Rufi let me be alone in the room and cry until I had no tears left and my eyes felt like sand. But the next day she insisted I come to the kitchen and not mourn by myself. It was sad to see how the elders of Santa Maria were keenly aware that after they were gone, an entire way of life would disappear. No one would grow wheat to make their own bread. No one would make butter from the milk of their own cows. No one would remember the names of the hills and country paths. They shared their stories with me, wanting me to take note of what was being lost individually and socially, so as to bear witness and remember. Years later, an ethnographic museum would be built near Leon, where tools they had worked with and carts they had used to transport hay and wheat would be placed on display. Thousands of my photographs would become part of the intangible heritage of the museum. And my book about the village in Spanish would acquire new meaning as the grandchildren and great-grandchildren of the villagers I'd known would meet their ancestors via my writing. I realized when listening to the stories about death in Santa Maria that everything I was hearing was being filtered through the sadness I felt being away from Zayde. How could I write about the stories people shared with me in Santa Maria without sharing the story of losing my grandfather as I was doing anthropology? There was so much irony in this collision of shared mortality. That summer, as an anthropologist, I gained deep knowledge of Catholic death customs in Santa Maria, yet I knew little about the death customs of my own Jewish ancestors and found myself unable to properly grieve for Zayde. All of these concerns found their way to my essay, Death and Memory. I'd never merged the personal and the ethnographic in my writing, and I didn't know if it would be dismissed as solipsistic by fellow anthropologists. Eventually, this essay became the opening chapter of The Vulnerable Observer. I was so nervous I developed a fever blister when I presented the first draft at the meeting of the American Anthropological Association. My body told me how strong the taboo is against self-revelation in anthropology. But I knew the path of vulnerability was the path I needed to follow. I'd come to see that the shared experience of storytelling made possible encounters between strangers that were like rivers converging. In moments of being present with one another, you felt an interconnectedness, both unexpected and beautiful. Such an encounter took place for me next in the town of Mezquitic in Mexico. In the evenings, when all the neighbors were watching the latest episode of the telenovela El Precio de la Fama, I would be visited by Esperanza Hernandez. She had made me spiritual kin by asking me to be her comadre, a position I acquired by buying the cake for her daughter's quinceañera party. She was a street peddler who made her living selling calla lilies and calabazas from her garden to city women in San Luis Potosí, which was half an hour away from Mezquitic. After a soft knock at the door, she'd rush into the courtyard of my little rented house, her rebozo wrapped around her head. Then we'd slip into the kitchen with the mint green walls. Her youngest son or daughter would come along. She wanted them to see the importance that I, an educated woman from el otro lado, the other side, gave to her life story. We'd take our seats around the kitchen table where I'd set out tea and cookies, After a few pleasantries, it was time for the storytelling to begin. "Well, comadre, are you ready?" she'd say. I'd flip on the tape recorder in the era before iPhones and say, "Ahora sí, comadre." The hours would pass as she spun her story, creating the enchantment only a master storyteller knows how to evoke. When it got close to midnight, she would jump up from her seat and say it was time to go. Late at night, she always told me one had to be careful. "Bueno, comadre, no vamos a esperar que se haga noche, she'd say. Then she'd whisper that the ghost of La Llorona could rise from the stream and give them all a fright. In this way, over a period of days, weeks, months, years, Esperanza shared her story with me. She was convinced her life story deserved to be in a book, even in a movie, and she had me convinced. Esperanza called her life stories her historias, literally her histories. She knew her historias mattered, even though she was considered a bruja, a witch, and ostracized by her neighbors. She had left her husband after he beat her and cheated on her. Soon after, he'd gone blind. And because she refused to be meek, the rumor spread in the town that she had used witchcraft to punish him. She said telling me her story was like going to confession. She imagined her story moving up a spiritual ladder. When you confess to the priest tells the bishop, then the bishop tells the archbishop, and so on, until finally the story reaches God. I had agreed to be responsible for her story, and it was up to me to pass her story on to readers who pass it on to other readers. But we were both aware of the irony of our arrangement and how her story was going to travel with me to the other side of the border and be in a book while she herself couldn't get across. I believe that in doing anthropological fieldwork, we are entrusted with stories that we take into our lives. That was what led me to include a brief final chapter called The Biography in the Shadow in the book I eventually wrote, Translated Woman, which was later published in Spanish. There I responded to Esperanza's historias with my own historias, but I was unsure of myself, and after I wrote the chapter, I came close to omitting it. I consulted with Gloria Ansaldúa, the author of Borderlands La Frontera, and she urged me not to be afraid and say what I needed to say. And so I wrote about my identity as a Cuban-American woman and the conflicts I'd had with my father, who at the time didn't think women needed an education, and the challenges I faced personally once I set foot in the academy. Esperanza recalled a childhood of poverty and violence, and becoming a mother who had children that died from swallowing the rage in her breast milk. She sought strength and confidence in storytelling and spiritism. She prayed to Pancho Villa, whose warrior energy offered spiritual protection. Our struggles were different, and we both spoke against the silence expected of us in each of our patriarchal worlds. It was through the shared storytelling with Esperanza that I found my way forward in writing with more courage. Yet it wasn't easy to face the criticism I received for writing that last chapter. Some said my story wasn't interesting, or wasn't relevant, or that I had been selfish in stealing the limelight from Esperanza. I was glad to receive letters from Latina and Latino students who told me Esperanza reminded them of their grandmothers and mothers, while I reminded them of themselves. They too were seeking a way to bring their lives and emotions into their work and still be able to make it in the academy. What we wanted was the freedom that Audre Lorde had written about in Poetry is Not a Luxury. The white fathers told us, I think, therefore I am. The black mother within each of us, the poet, whispers in our dreams, I feel, therefore I can be free. Okay, when I was a kid, I was terrified the day I started first grade because I didn't speak English. Once I learned English, my parents warned me, "Cuidado, no hables mucho," urging me to be very careful about what I said. We were spooked by the thought that we could be deported and returned to Castro's regime if we acted contrary to American laws. And then, in the 1990s, I decided I needed to return to Cuba. After my journeys to Spain and Mexico, I had to visit the island that was once my home. But how could I go to a place my family had fled under duress, as so many Cubans had in the early years following the 1959 revolution? My parents worried about my safety. They begged me not to go. Once there, I came to understand them better. I observed what it's like when people live in fear of their government. I saw how people in Cuba never dared to say the name of Fidel Castro out loud. In conversation, they alluded to him silently with the gesture of stroking their chins as though stroking the beard of El Comandante. And so I went, carrying that terror and guilt with me. I had panic attacks. I was dizzy. I wept till my body shivered. I had nightmares. Ghosts followed me as I walked the streets of Havana, tracing the footsteps of my parents, grandparents, and great-grandparents. On the way back, I always feared that immigration officers wouldn't let me go, that they'd find a reason to detain or arrest me. I imagined a cruel voice saying, "It's the punishment you deserve for going back." On the initial trips, all I wanted was to stand in the places where I had stood as a child, as if I could reclaim those places by inhabiting them again in my adult body. I then began to wander into the synagogues in Havana, meeting people in the small Jewish community who were reclaiming an identity they had kept hidden during the heyday of the revolution. After several years of return trips, I made a film, Adiós Querida, which I dedicated to my father. And it was shown here at the Michigan Theater. The film was a mosaic of stories about the Sephardic Jews living in Cuba and in the diaspora. Danaida and Miguelito, two young people of Afro-Cuban and Jewish-Cuban heritage, spoke with pride about their mixed identities, while my father, like others who had left and never returned, still clung to his memories of the life he left behind. I then traveled across the island from Havana to Palma Soriano, documenting how Jews in Cuba had held on to material things that kept them connected to their Jewish heritage. For my book, An Island Called Home, people held up for my gaze a photograph of the last quinceañera celebrated at the Jewish Community Center in Havana in 1959, the prayer shawl that belonged to a beloved grandfather from Turkey, a postcard in Yiddish sent from a concentration camp to family in Cuba, and a handmade fan made out of a matzah box. It's kind of hot up here. I became the guardian of stories that felt like mirrors into lives that might have been mine had my parents chosen to stay in Cuba. Though my parents still worried every time I was there, they were glad to hear the stories of those on the island who were preserving a Jewish heritage for all of us. There was one person in Cuba who knew me and my family intimately, and that was Caro, the woman who was my childhood nanny. She told me stories about my early years that no one else had told me. I often ate with her and her family, and we traveled together, sharing a bed when we needed to. She was a memory keeper and remembered everyone in my family. She kept our pictures in the same box where she kept pictures of her family. She hoped my mother would return for a visit and always asked about her. Then one day, Caro surprised me and said, "Yo no creo que tu mamá va a volver a Cuba. I don't think your mother's going to come back to Cuba." With that, she disappeared into her bedroom and came back with a plastic bag. Caro passed the bag to me and said in a whisper, "Dale esto a tu mamá." Give this to your mother. Inside were the 2 lace honeymoon nightgowns my mother had left behind when we fled Cuba. My mother wept tears of joy and longing for her lost youth when she saw the nightgowns in the shape of her young woman's body. That was 1956. Caro said she thought my mother would like to have them, and that's why she had saved them. She had rescued lost things from the obscurity of time and placed in my hands intimate garments that symbolized more than she or my mother could say. I've written essays about Caro and the gift of the stories that she shared with me. But I hope one day the nightgowns will speak to me in more detail, and the novel I've tried to write about her relationship with my mother will get written. Poems were what I could write most easily as I went back and forth to Cuba. I wrote poems to describe things I couldn't say as an anthropologist, and I wrote because I had the good fortune to have a story listener in Cuba who became my mentor and friend and collaborator on handmade books. This story listener was Rolando Esteves, a poet and artist who lived in Matanzas with his partner, Samuel, for 32 years. Sadly, Esteves died in January 2023. Samuel died a year later in 2024. Esteves went through a terrible trauma in his youth. His parents and younger sister left Cuba for Miami in 1969 when he was 15. He was of military age and couldn't leave the country. Later, when he might have left, he decided it was his destiny to stay on the island. One of his poems tells the story of how his father took him to the movies while his mother packed her bag. Years later, his mother returned to see him, but his sister, whom he missed, never wanted to return to Cuba. In her absence, I appeared and became his bridge to those of us who'd been taken out of Cuba as children and longed to find our roots. Esteves designed unique handmade books in which my poems came alive. For my collection of poems, Everything I Kept, Todo Lo Que Guardé, he created a 3-dimensional book with a suitcase on the cover that opened and closed with strips of Velcro that he asked me to send him. The suitcase was lined with sand from Baradero Beach, where my parents spent their honeymoon. I'm touching the sand of Cuba. Later on, Esteves created a golden suitcase in which souvenirs of my travels and my essay, The Key to the House, could be kept, along with a painting of a woman with wings. I'll show you all the artwork there. I am honored that this suitcase is part of the amazing collection of Esteves' handmade books that are preserved right here with love and care at our graduate library special collections. We were so lucky to have Esteves visit the University of Michigan and offer workshops where he shared with students his passion for creating handmade books. For one of his last, most ambitious projects, Esteves told me he wanted to dress me in poetry and made a book in the form of a bridal poetry dress sewn to fit my body precisely that holds poems by women from Cuba and the United States. Called Otra Piel para Otras Entrañas, Another Skin for New Insides, Esteves made this one-of-a-kind work in Cuba. You can see there's my poem in Spanish. made this one-of-a-kind work in Cuba by the light of a lantern, a quinqué, when the electricity went out. That's a quinqué. A small one. No, okay. Yeah. And often hungry when there was no food to be found in the market. This work is now one of the treasures of the Library of Congress and part of the exhibit on collecting memories. You can see it there. All right. So Esteves was always observing me. Like Esperanza, who knew I loved stories, he became the anthropologist, studying me as much as I was studying him. He revealed the possibility of anthropology as an encounter between friends, one who had lost a country, one who had lost a family, both seeking clarity through the making of art. He urged me to write in Spanish and read and commented on my poems and fiction throughout the 30 years that we knew each other. Even at the end of his life, he read what I was writing and shared his thoughts in our conversations via WhatsApp in between his blood transfusions. I will always remain grateful to Esteves because he cared about the artist that I longed to be. Perhaps because I was a girl whose childhood was interrupted, I keep returning to memories of my youth and am now finding a voice as a writer of stories about girls on the verge of adulthood. This all became clearer to me when my mother recently surprised me with something she had never told me she had taken out of Cuba in her suitcase, my blue school uniform, which I wore for a few months before we left. Yeah. It has a Jewish star embroidered on the pockets. But what I find especially poignant is its thick hem. Let's see. The uniform was meant to be let out as my body grew, and it wasn't let out. I was not to grow up in Cuba. I began my journey into fiction by writing an autobiographical novel, Lucky Broken Girl, about a car accident that left me confined to my bed for a year. And Rolando Esteves made these images, by the way, that one and this one. Then I wrote Letters from Cuba, inspired by my Polish-Jewish maternal grandmother's journey to Cuba and how she helped bring her family to the island on the eve of the Holocaust. My most recent novel, Across So Many Seas, is the most ambitious and experimental. This story is inspired by my paternal Turkish-Jewish grandmother's journey. Abuela was sent to Cuba by her parents in the mid-1920s and never saw them again. The reason for her sea crossing was uncertain, but Abuela brought an oud with her, an instrument that many young Turkish women played in those years, and she sang Sephardic songs. The oud and the singing were set aside when she married and became a mother. With those few details of Abuela's story, I wove together Across So Many Seas, creating 4 protagonists, Benvenida, Reina, Alegra, and Paloma, each 12 years old, each living in a time of historical change in Spain, Turkey, Cuba, and the US. Spanning 500 years, the story begins in Toledo in 1492, as the expulsion of the Jewish community is taking place, and ends in Toledo today, where the memory of the community is preserved in the Sephardic Museum housed in a 14th century synagogue. The anthropologist and the writer wrestled with each other as I wrote this book. The anthropologist wanted to do research, and the writer wanted to imagine the stories missing in the archives. It all came together when I learned from a 1492 chronicle that girls and women sang Spanish songs and played the tambourine as they were departing their homeland. It occurred to me that the thread that would tie the four stories together would be a Sephardic song about a girl in a tower in the sea who longs for a home and freedom. En la mar hay una torre, en la torre una ventana, en la ventana una isla que a los marineros llama. In the end, I had to be an anthropologist to write this book. The experience of living in Santa Maria as a young anthropologist and hiding my Jewishness had not been in vain. It was essential for conjuring the era of 1492. What is true of all the fiction I am writing is that travels to real places and encounters with actual people have led to travel via the imagination and stories crafted from memories collected over the years. Now, when crossing seas, I am entrusting myself to float on a raft of words. I've lived with so much fear throughout my life. I've lived with the fear of speaking up. I've lived with the fear that, like my parents and ancestors before me, I might be forced to pack a suitcase with a few small things that will bring back memories and go someplace where I'll always be a traveler, as the poet Dulce Maria Loinas put it, who reaches the port and no one awaits her. I never forget I am an immigrant. I find it unbearable to see the rounding up of other immigrants, their hands and feet shackled. Their lives have been demeaned because their personal stories are being replaced by stories of an other who is less than human. We are seeing the truths of history erased by those who are neither story listeners nor storytellers, but story erasers, who seek to vilify immigrants, the poor, women, LGBTQ individuals and communities, and people of color. I've spent years talking to people who, from an outsider perspective, would be considered the poor, peasant farmers in Spain, a street peddler in Mexico who eked out a living on a few dollars a week, Jewish people in Cuba who depended on the meals the synagogue provided, a brilliant artist who transformed humble materials into works of beauty. And from them, I have gained wisdom essential to the understanding of the human condition. In these times, many of us are scared. We are seeing horrible loss of homes and lives from hurricanes and fires and war and hunger and disease. When I think back to all my travels, to how I inserted myself in places where I knew no one, I wonder whether the world was safer then, or was I just young and naive and didn't worry as much as I do now? The world has changed. Many places are no longer safe, including the region in Mexico, where I spent all those years listening to Esperanzas Historias. And there is reason to fear that as time goes on, fewer places will be safe, fewer places will be welcoming. Yet I have hope that anthropology, a profession once aligned with colonialism, is perhaps now one of the few intellectual projects that can elucidate the diversity of culture, language, and heritage while advocating for universal human rights. Telling and listening to stories may not seem like enough in these times, yet stories have a great power. When we tell stories that have not yet been told, when we tell stories that challenge official narratives or give voice to silenced narratives, we give ourselves permission to imagine new possibilities for our present and our future, where instead of fear and small-mindedness, there is trust and the open hand of generosity. Stories that were shared with me, I've now shared with you. The circle of the gift continues. It is now up to you to decide where these stories go next. And with that, I just want to say thank you so much. Thanks to all of you for being here today. Thanks to all the amazing students I've worked with over the years. Thanks to wonderful colleagues in so many disciplines, including Latino studies, Latin American and Caribbean studies, women's studies, Judaic studies. Thanks to the faculty, staff, and students of the Department of Anthropology. Thanks to our wonderful chair, Dr. Kelly Askew. Thanks to my family, to David, my son Gabriel, Sasha, my granddaughters. Thanks to my parents, Mommy and Papi, who taught me immigrant pride. Thanks to the ancestors who got me this far. And I just want to show you some of my students and my parents watching on YouTube via New York. Thank you so much, Mommy, Papi. Thank you, all of you. Thanks so much.
Professor Bahar, thank you for your lecture. Would be willing to take a few questions from the audience?
Of course. Thank you.
I believe we have microphones that will come around if anybody would like to ask a question. I'm happy to start. I have a question. I think in your closing remarks, you talked about the circle of gifts. Could you talk a little bit about how that worked in your first site at Santa Maria and the pictures that now appear in the museum, and your relationship with the grandchildren and great-grandchildren of those that you worked with?
Thank you for that question. Well, you know, I was so young when I started that fieldwork, and I think that's true for so many anthropologists. We start when we're so young. And I kind of arrived, and and one of the people said to me, I want you to get a really good grade for this, and we're going to help you. And so, like, what do you want to know about us? So people were just very open in terms of telling their stories and sharing, and it was all so new to me because I had grown up in New York and the city, so the country life was so incredibly new to me. So I think just their willingness to tell me stories about their lives. I was focusing at the time on communal land tenure. I was really interested in lands that were shared by the community when they were needed, and on inheritance. And they just shared all of this information with me. And it was reciprocal in that one of the things my professor did tell me to do, once I said, well, wait, am I doing fieldwork correctly? And he said, take a census, go from door to door of the village and find out who lives in each house and how many cows and sheep and so on they have. So I did that. Some of the people at first were suspicious. Why do you want to know like how many cows and sheep we have? And I said, no, just to know. And so they told me. And then what would happen was that everybody wanted to chat. So I thought the census would take a week to do, but it took 3 months because each house I would go to, people wanted me to spend the whole afternoon talking with them. So that was very beautiful. So I think it was just the way people shared, and then I would tell them a little bit about myself and about being from Cuba and so on, and so they knew a little bit of my story, I knew their story. And then I would go back and forth, which I think also is important in anthropology, because sometimes people go to a place and then they never come back. But in my case, I would go summer after summer and then spent a year and then went back over and over. I was just there 2 years ago. And so they like that because I always come back. Like, I'm not sort of ever saying a final goodbye. I'm always coming back. So I think that's part of the circle of connections and of exchange. And that website that you saw briefly, I helped with that too. I gave them all the photographs and a lot of the stories so that they could post that on the website. And now I'm actually close friends with the grandson of one of the first people that I met in the village. And so every time we go to Spain, we see him and his family. So that's all been really, really interesting. And I still feel like when I go to Spain, I always have to go to that village. It's like that's where I do feel that I have some roots. And I'm also very close, to add to that, to Polonia's grandson as well, who now lives in Madrid. And so he's read everything I've written about the village as well. And so that's kind of another connection, that now the writing is something that I've been able to give back to the community. So that's really wonderful.
Beautiful. Like, I don't want to stand up because I'm tall and stopping the view, but you touched me so much because I'm also immigrant and I left and I cannot go back. So your story and everything was like, oh my God, this exists. But I'm a computer scientist, and we build the technology with a claim that we facilitate communication between cultures and societies. And I just kept wondering, did we ruin it? Because now I think the physical touch of a region, the smell of the soil when it rains in those villages. I mean, we won't have this kind of, like the budget even, because you can video call those people. Why be, accommodate physical travels? How this affects the future generation? What do you think the next generation will hear?
That is such an amazing question, and I do think about it a lot. And I was trying kind of to get into that relationship between the digital and the real by bringing in the real objects, right? Like almost like an archaeologist, like I wanted to show you my artifacts. But yet you could also see it on the screen. So I was kind of going in that double direction. And yeah, I'm of two minds about that, because on the one hand, yes, there was something very special about that time, the pre-tech time, let's call it that. But then on the other hand, I can be in touch with people now much more easily than in the past, when we would go to Spain and then it would take like a month for a letter to get there and another letter to get back. And when I first started working there wasn't even a telephone in the village, so if any emergency messages had to be relayed, you couldn't get them. You had to go to the next village, like 5 miles away. So that made it complicated. So there was kind of that problem. And now, with some of the friends that I just mentioned, the grandchildren of the people that I met, I can be in touch with them, be it via WhatsApp, and talk to them, find out what's going on, and get, sort of keep in touch in a sense a little bit more closely by having the tech advantage. So kind of it's like, I think it's true for maybe for all of society that we have kind of those two things wrestling with each other. It's kind of nice to have the tech and be able, like, if I need to reach somebody from the village, I can contact them. But on the other hand, I remember once receiving a letter from one of the villagers in Spain, and it was so sweet. So it was a letter with all the stamps on it. And then on the envelope itself, the mailman, whose name was Abilio was the mailman. He'd come like once a week and bring the mail in his car. And he had written "Saludos" from Abilio on the envelope itself. So like the mailman was greeting me as well as like the person who was sending me the letter. I can't repeat that. That's like totally unique. So we've lost some things inevitably with any kind of social transformation. We've lost some things, we've gained some others. So it's a mix. I'd say it's a sense of a mix of the two. Thank you.
We have time for...
Oh, we have one.
Yep, go ahead. We'll do these two.
So, first of all, thank you so much. Incredibly powerful talk. I wanted to ask, so as a person who enjoys a lot of fictional stories, literary stories, often when I read stories, there's a little bit of trying to understand the author through reading the text, because a lot of the way a story is told is reflected by an author, and there's also a part of understanding a culture of, I guess, what is being represented. And oftentimes that may be the same thing, because a author might be writing about her own culture or her own experiences in the form of a different character, but one of the things that you were mentioning is hearing other people's stories and then writing them into fictional works. Do you think it's ever truly possible to separate your own story from another person's story when writing that, or do you think there will always be some fragment of you that shows up in that text?
Wow, that's a great question. Do you want to be in my graduate seminar? That's a very good question. Well, let me say, first of all, just to clarify that when I'm doing my anthropological work, I don't really take people's stories and turn them into fiction. When I'm doing, ethnographic work, which is nonfiction, I'm focusing on the stories that people have actually told me and try to relay them in a very precise and accurate way on the page, drawing on recordings and notes and so on. So I don't do that. But when I create fictional characters, I might be inspired by people that I know or that I've met, and then maybe take bits and pieces from different people and create a fictional character. So I feel like there's a distinction there between the two, but But I agree with you that very much the author is always present in some way in whatever it is you're writing. Even if you're writing something that appears to not be autobiographical at all, whether it's science fiction or another fantasy genre, etc., there's still going to be something of the author, what the author knows, the author's positionality, what the author has experienced. I mean, all those things, what the author has read, because what I often say, and I think I heard this and now I just repeat it, you can only write as well as what you read. So as a writer, you also have to be reading, because that's where you connect with other writers and gain inspiration for your own writing. So kind of each author is kind of a mix of all those things, of your personal background, your intellectual background, and then what you've read and what you know as well, and what you've experienced, and all of that, is what inspires you to write and to tell a story. Thank you.
Hi, I was really moved to see your school uniform from when you were a little girl, and I was wondering if you ever got to have a conversation with your mother about why she selected that item among what I imagine were not that many things she was able to take with her.
That is so true. Well, I will have to ask her. I'll be seeing her soon, and she's watching on YouTube, hopefully, if my parents were able to connect. And I will ask her, but I think she just thought it was important. It was just something that was meaningful to her. And so the CHA stands for Colegio Hebreo Autónomo, the autonomous Jewish school, I guess, or day school. And I think it was important because she grew up in the countryside, but when she was about 8 years old, the family moved to the city of Havana, and she went to the same school. And so I think, I was starting in the same school that she had gone to, where instruction was in Spanish and Yiddish, interestingly. So that was the school that she had gone to. She didn't love learning Yiddish, but she was going to make me learn Yiddish. And so, I got sent to the school, but then the revolution came, and, I didn't get to learn Yiddish, and I didn't get to go to school there. But so I think that, I'm guessing that may be one of the reasons why it was significant that it had that connection back to her story, too. But I will ask her. Yeah.
We now need to close the lecture. Please join me in thanking Professor Bahar, our Henry Russell lecturer.